Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm here with Maria. She's one of my favorite admission consultants. I worked with her extensively before coming to Michigan. And we are going to do a session that's about business school rankings. I can't say the session title out loud because of YouTube algorithms, but you know what it's about. So, Maria, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Hey there, all you cool cats and kittens out there in GMAT Club land.
Did you just do
Um,
a Tiger King reference?
I did just do a Tiger King reference.
Very nice.
So, how's it going, everyone? I hope everyone, first of all, is staying safe during these very scary times. My name is Maria. As Souvik mentioned, I have been an MBA admissions consultant for quite some time. I went to Harvard Business School, where I started volunteering with the admissions office, and I've been giving advice ever since for 16 going on 17 years now. And I am the founder of ApplicantLab.com, which replaces the need for expensive admissions consultants because it's an online DIY platform where I just give you all the advice you need through a series of interactive exercises and videos. And so for a fraction of the price, you get world-class advice.
Awesome. So, Maria, today we're going to talk about business school rankings. And I have a bunch of questions for you that I always wanted to ask someone. But before we get into the question, you told me that you're going to tell me how rankings are done, methodologies, and some behind the scenes stuff, right? So, I'm going to go off the screen right now. I'm going to let you have the screen, and then you can take it over.
All right. Sounds great. So let me pull up my little PowerPoint. Let me see. Slideshow from beginning. All right. Can you guys see my slideshow? Okay. All right. So I thought what we would do is we would cover the two biggest or the most sort of famous or influential rankings. One is the US News and World Report ranking, and the second is the Financial Times ranking. And I'm not going to go through like every little detail of it, but I did want to sort of give you guys the information about how are these rankings even calculated, because there is such a difference in terms of which factors are taken into account, how much is each factor weighted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So first of all, let's look at US News and World Report. US News and World Report, one of the things that's interesting is that they, about 40% of their weighting or their ranking is weighted upon almost like a very qualitative, fuzzy concept of like assessment, right? So when they ask deans or staff at other business schools, okay, which business school do you think is the best? But you can't name your own. Where would you rank them? And then they also ask recruiters, like the corporate recruiters who come to these campuses, which schools, like how would you rank them? And so this is an interesting perspective to get, but it's also highly qualitative, right? Like if a recruiter, for example, goes to a school and the students there are amazing, but let's say they hire the students or give them job offers, and then the students say, well, no, never mind, I'm going to take a job someplace better, like at Amazon, and I'm not going to go work for you, then that recruiter's feelings are probably going to be hurt or they're going to be bummed out. And so therefore the recruiter assessment score might go down, even if the quality of the school and the quality of the students is amazing. So I want people to be aware of the fact that sometimes some of these rankings, with the US News and World Report in particular, an enormous percentage of it is based on very sort of qualitative ideas around, well, how good do you think the school is? So realize that this could be very easily manipulated one way or the other by a school, right? Conversely, a school that might not be so great, if they treat the recruiters to a 5-course steak dinner with lots of wine or whatever, if they come to campus, then that recruiter is probably going to say, oh yeah, I really love that school, even if the school itself isn't that great. And then the other thing I want everyone to realize is that they place about 35%, about a third of their ranking is based upon employment outcomes, right? So the salary being high, and then the employment rate. Notice that the employment rate, this is like the employment rate 3 months after graduation, it's at 21%. So they actually care more about people accepting jobs as opposed to how much money they make. Now, why is this relevant? Because sometimes when you see that a school has, say, a lower employment rate 3 months after graduation, the immediate temptation might be to think, okay, well, this school, they just can't get their graduates jobs. But in some cases, that might not be the truth. In some cases, maybe students are simply holding out for better jobs because they know that they can find a better job. And so they're not necessarily jumping at the first offer they get. So I think that the 3 months post-graduation employment rate is also a slightly suspicious, it's a factor that I think should be taken with a grain of salt, because at some schools, people might say, well, look, I really want to work in, say, private equity, and I know I can get that job. Maybe it's a job that people at other schools can't even get the interview for, but I'm going to hold out for that job, even if it means that I have to wait 6 months after graduation to get it. And then, so the GMAT and GRE, GPA, and acceptance rate, that's 25%. And at least one of the things I do like about that is that it is a quantitative way to measure the general quality of the school. Now, the GMAT GRE score at only 16% is, the biggest one of the kind of selectivity rankings. I do think that the downside of that is that sometimes schools then try to game the rankings too much. I think there is a particular school that, the one that immediately comes to mind that I won't mention, but their name begins with a Y and it rhymes with jail. They, I think, have been really playing the GMAT rankings game insofar as over the past several years, as they have tried and tried and tried, rightfully so, to get into the top parts of the rankings. I think part of that has included overhauling their curriculum, which has been wonderful. But the downside has been, I've also think that they have been turning away candidates with lower GMAT scores that I do believe in the past would have been shoo-ins for Yale. So anyway, that's the U.S. News and World Report methodology. So now let's look at the Financial Times methodology. This one, as you can see, instead of looking at, let's see, how many is this? Like 7. This is 7 things. Financial Times, I think, looks at 20 different things, and so that's like 1% here, 2% there, 3%, over there. And so it's a bit of a mess. And I think that a significant portion of the Financial Times, if you look, the career outcomes are 63%. That's 2/3, versus career outcomes for U.S. News and World Report are about, just a smidge over 1/3. So the Financial Times really puts an enormous amount of emphasis on what are those career outcomes, especially like, the alumni salary is 20%. And then another 20% is comparing what's your salary 3 years after you graduate to what your salary was before you enrolled. So some people might say, well, this is perfect, right? Because after all, the whole reason I'm going to business school is to make a ton of money, let's be honest. And so why not have that be the ultimate measure? But I do worry a little bit that I think that this can be gamed by the schools, just like how the GMAT score can be gamed. I think this can be gamed a little bit too, insofar as, first of all, a school might then say, well, if 20% of my ranking depends upon how much money people are making 3 years out, maybe I'm going to let in people based primarily upon who I think is going to be making the most amount of money the next 3 years out, regardless of how much positive impact I think they're going to have in the world. Now, it is true that the Financial Times, for this salary calculation, they do remove people who are at either end of the spectrum. So if people do go into nonprofit, they remove those lower salaries from the calculation. And they also remove, every business school class is going to have like the one person who goes back to their dad's PE firm and makes, $1 million the first year. So they do remove the outliers. And then the second one I think is interesting is this compared to the pre-MBA salary, because then it almost gives schools an incentive to accept people who are at lower salary levels than other schools, right? Because if not, I know as an admissions officer, let's say for me, the Financial Times rankings mattered a lot. I'm going to say to myself, well, instead of letting in people who are 27 years old, who are making $100,000 a year, let me let in people who are 27 years old, who haven't been quite as financially successful yet, who are making less, because I know that multiple for them, that delta between where they were pre-business school and where they are today is going to be so much higher. So I do worry a little bit about that potentially being something that they try to game a little bit. I also have here, if you look at, there's about 20% total of what I bucketed together, and I called it the diversity/global stuff. These are things like female faculty, female students, international faculty, international students. And look, first of all, I'm a woman, so clearly I think it's important for there to be female faculty and female students. And as someone who has an international background, and as someone who has, some of my best friends from business school are all international students, I absolutely think that there's a lot of value in having diverse perspectives in the business school classroom, both in terms of the faculty and the students, though I don't necessarily know that so I went to Harvard. Would I have not gone to Harvard? Like if Harvard had been 25% women instead of 30% women as students. At the time, it was lower than it is these days. Or if there would have been more female professors versus, I don't think that would have changed at all the decision that I made in terms of which school to go to. So it seems a little bit strange to me that this is part of it. They even have, it's only 1%, but this one, whether or not down here it says extra language, like whether or not you emerge from the program with facility in some sort of foreign language. I mean, clearly, that's INSEAD, right? So it's like, this is like the 1% INSEAD bonus, where it's like, let's find the school that requires you to learn an extra language, and we're going to give them that little 1% bonus. And then another one that I think is interesting is that one of the other big, in terms of the individual factors that they give a big percentage to is research rank. Which is basically trying to get a sense of, okay, the faculty at business schools, a lot of what they spend their time doing when they're not teaching, they're doing research. And so how good is the faculty at a given school at doing research? And this is another one of those things where it's only, I think, as a student, it only really impacts your experience on a very shallow level, right? So if you, let's say you are studying a case in business school that has to do with, how the city of Pittsburgh is implementing self-driving cars. If you go to the business school where the professor wrote that case, sure, maybe the professor might be able to introduce you to the person in the city of Pittsburgh that led that self-driving car initiative. But just because the professor that wrote the case doesn't teach at your school, like, you're still going to learn from the case. So I don't know that the research rank from a student's, from being a student, I don't think that necessarily impacts the quality of the education or the experience. And I would actually say that some of the best business schools teachers I ever had were people who didn't have necessarily PhDs. Oh, that's the one right above this, the faculty with doctorates. That's 5%. Like, some of the best business school teachers are the ones who didn't get PhDs, who went out into industry, who grew businesses, who sold businesses, who invested in businesses, right? That's one of the reasons that, for example, Columbia Business School is such a strong program, because if you want to work in hedge funds, I have a friend who runs a hedge fund, and he teaches as a night, he teaches a night class for Columbia Business School students who want to do hedge funds. So I would argue, and maybe I'm just saying this because I don't have a PhD, but I would argue that learning how to do hedge fund stuff from someone who runs a hedge fund, as opposed to someone who has simply studied the theory of hedge funds, I would think that the practitioner would give you more, a little bit more, valuable insight. So these are some of the sort of, I think, pros and cons of the two different methodologies. But I think the main takeaways here are, like, look at just how different they are, right? Look at how there's just, there's sort of this idea around, they both deal with salary, this idea of how much money you make. But once you get beyond that, there really are quite tremendous differences in terms of what they're judging. And so then when we look at them side by side, I know this might be a little bit small on your screen, but so obviously another thing that I forgot to mention a second ago that is a huge downside element of the US News ranking is that they are only looking at US business schools, which I think is a bit of a shame, because we live in an increasingly global world. And so only looking at US business schools is like, it's always struck me as, when the United States, the Major League Baseball Association has something called the World Series every year, but it's not the World Series. It's the best U.S. teams. It's not like they're not bringing in the Venezuelan baseball team or the Japanese baseball team to compete in the World Series. So it's the same thing. It's like, well, okay, like, you could call it the best business schools ranking, but let's be honest, like, by only focusing on the U.S., you are leaving out some pretty significant contenders from the list. So here are the two side by side, and Souvik, if we can jump in and start talking about this. The one thing that I thought was a little bit interesting to the point I made earlier about how I think some of the Financial Times judgment on that delta in pre-MBA compensation versus post-MBA compensation. One of the ways that I think it's a little bit easier to manipulate, or might be a bit of a strange thing to look at, is, for example, if we look here at the first one here, Harvard Business School, that post-MBA salary is $210,000 a year, which is a 110% increase. So that implies that prior to business school, the average Harvard Business School student was making $100,000 a year, versus if you look at CEBS in China or similarly ESA in Spain, if we sort of back in and do the math, these are people who are making $65,000 to $68,000 a year accordingly. So some of that could be based on geography, different geographies pay different amounts. But at the same time, it is also a question of like, okay, well, if I know that I'm going to be 20% of my ranking is based upon, making sure that this jump is as big as possible, maybe I am going to let in slightly lower level, people who haven't quite achieved the same level of corporate success as other programs. So I think that's a little bit, I do think that's kind of a weird metric to use. And I think of all the ones in the Financial Times, I think that's the one I disagree with the most.
Maria, do you think they take purchasing power into account at all? Because, for example, if somebody with a pre-MBA background in consulting in India, on like an absolute dollar level, they were probably making, I don't know, $35,000, $40,000. But $35,000, $40,000 in India is screaming money.
Right.
So, like there are other factors like that as well.
Yeah, no. So it does not appear that they take because then if you were to look at the purchasing power, I would assume that like the ISBs and the IIMs and all the other top business schools in other developing nations would probably do much better as well. So it is a bit of a strange, it is a very European, I mean, I know that CEBS is right there at number 5, but I feel like the Financial Times, since they are a European publication, I feel like they're kind of trying to find little ways to make the European programs, like the one about like
extra language,
the language one. Like, come on, okay.
That's like a special rank so that NCR is at number 1 every time.
Yeah, right. Because I think, as far as I know, I think they're the only business school that requires you to, to learn a language, or I don't remember exactly what but they have some sort of requirement with foreign languages, right? So, it's a little like, come on, guys, you seem to have an agenda, and it kind of seems like maybe they're trying to choose the methodology that fits the agenda.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. The question that I had for you was, so by the way, if you do you have any more slides? Otherwise, I'll skip that screen share over.
Oh, well, so I was going to talk about a little bit around, and we can show up the slide later, the idea of how much weight should someone give to the rankings when they are deciding which schools to go to.
Why don't we do that first, and then I'll keep my questions after.
Okay, cool. So awesome. One of the things about the rankings that I think the rankings, look, it's a great place to start your research, especially if the rankings compile a bunch of data on a school in one place. I do think for the US programs, the US News rankings are great to look at because they tell you like right away, like average GMAT score, average GPA. So that way you can at least use the rankings as that first stop to say like, okay, how competitive am I, right? Obviously, if you've got like a 520 on the GMAT and you see that the programs that you're interested in all have 730s as averages, you will probably have to adjust your expectations accordingly. So I do think that the rankings can be good for that. I do like that also that the US News rankings have like sub rankings. So they'll have like the real estate rankings or the marketing rankings. And I think that those are actually a better place to start to look than the overall rankings. I think the problem with the rankings is that people get very, very negatively obsessed with them in the way that it's just like, it becomes this like one track mind type of thing where it's like, I just have to focus on the ranking. I have to focus on the ranking. Not even asking like, is this the best school for me? Is this the outcome I'm going to want to get? If somebody gets, a full ride, for example, in general, Chicago Booth offers, is famous for offering more scholarships than Wharton does. And Chicago Booth is building out an amazing finance school. They have built out in recent years, an incredible private equity research center. So yeah, like Wharton is amazing, but that doesn't mean like if Booth gives you a full ride, there's something to be said for maybe thinking about that instead of being like, well, I'm just going to look at the rankings. Simultaneously or at the same time, like, for example, people who are introverts are not going to have a great time at Harvard Business School. They can get in, they can get through it, but they're not going to love it the way people who love to talk like me loved it, right? So people are just, they get sort of obsessed with, the rankings. And I think in some ways we have to think about the fact that at the end of the day, US News and World Report in particular charges for detailed access to the rankings. It's like a $30 fee a year. It's not a huge amount of money, but they're still trying to make money off of it. And so if US News and World Report, like this year, the thing that was getting everyone excited and talking was, oh my God, Harvard fell to number 6. But at the end of the day, the publications that publish these rankings, they are news publications. They make money based on clicks and subscriptions. They need to drive that conversation. They need to drive that people saying, oh my gosh, did you see that Harvard fell to 6? If the rankings were always Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, blah, blah, if they were always the same from year to year to year, when the rankings were to come out each year, no one would even notice, right? We wouldn't even be talking about it if the rankings were the same every year. So please realize the other thing is that the people who write these rankings, the publications who publish them, they have an ulterior motive to shake things up, right? It's in their best interest for there to be shocking surprises or, controversial decisions in there. So realize that the person putting together this rankings, they are not thinking about you, the applicant, what is best for you in your life and for your career. They don't care about you. They just want you to click and to pay for the subscription. And I think the problem with that is that it can actually be damaging, right? I have a client who recently was accepted to Harvard Business School and MIT Sloan, and this person is not from the United States. They're from another country, and they wrote me like in a panic when these rankings came out, these new U.S. News. Oh my God, Harvard is now below Sloan. I really wanted to go to Harvard. Harvard's been my dream school, but now that they're 6th versus 5th, maybe I shouldn't go there. And I was like, oh my God, what? Are you serious? Like, no. Do you think anyone in the world out there is like, oh, you know what? Harvard Business School, it's now 6th versus 5th for Sloan. Therefore, I now think it's X% less of a school. No, that is a terrible, terrible reason to choose a school. So only choosing a school because it's high in the rankings it might be a terrible reason to choose a school, but also saying like, well, I'm not going to go to this school because it's lower in the rankings. That is ridiculous. There are so many schools that can get you where you want to go. There are some schools that can get you where you want to go better than other schools that might not have anything to do with where the ranking is or what have you. And so to give you, here's sort of like the illustrative example that I use all the time. So let's say real estate is like the thing you want to do, right? Maybe you've been working in something else so far in your career, and you've just, for whatever reason, you've learned about real estate, you've started to get interested in it, and you're like, you know what, this is what I want to do with my life and my career. I need to go into real estate. Now, so you realize that you want to get the MBA to try to make that transition. Now, the problem is if you go to an MBA program, you get that post-MBA real estate job, and if you're bad at that job, your career's not going to advance, right? So sometimes people see like business school as like the means to the end, like, oh, well, I should go because that's how I'm going to get that interview for that real estate job. That's how I'm going to land that real estate job. And then they don't think ahead to the fact of like, oh, I actually need to be good at real estate in order for my career to move forward from that point, right? So let's say you don't have a background in real estate, but you're desperate. That's what you want to work in and you want to be successful in. Well, let's look at the differences between two different top schools, the real estate offerings that they have, because this is something you really need to research carefully. The offerings, spoiler alert, the offerings that different schools have on the elective level vary wildly. Here's my illustrative example. So here on the left are some program, the program who has 3 real estate electives, right? One sort of immersion course, a real estate private equity course, and then just sort of a general real estate overview course. So this is a top school. They have 3 electives in real estate. Let's compare another top 10 school that also has a real estate program. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 electives. So when you look at these two different course offerings. Ask yourself, which one of these schools is going to give me that background knowledge and that foundational knowledge so that when I get that job, getting the job that's not the finish line, friends. Getting the job is not the finish line. Succeeding in that job after you graduate, that's where your career really turns around, right? If you get that real estate job and you stink at it, you're going to get fired. So what does it matter? So I bring this up because what's really kind of shocking about this slide for a lot of people is that the school on the left is Harvard and the school on the right is Columbia Business School. Now, I went to Harvard and I'm very biased in favor of it. So of course, I think people who get into Harvard should, look into it and definitely consider going there. But if you want to go into real estate, first of all, is Harvard like, oh my God, I have to get into Harvard. And if I don't get into Harvard, my life is over. Is that the case? Oh, no, it's not actually the case. In fact, I would argue if you really, really, really want to go into real estate, your career is probably better off going to Columbia, even though it's a quote unquote lower ranked school, whatever that means, right? So I want you realize, like when you're early in the admissions process, people tend to fixate on the rankings and they're like, whatever it takes, I just have to go into one of these top schools. But realize that you are going to be a consumer. You are going to have to make a significant investment. Most people who go to MBA programs, regardless of their purchasing power of their initial country, Souvik, as you probably know all too well, you're going to have to take out that loan, that student loan in US dollars. You're probably going to have to go between $150,000 to $200,000 US dollars into debt. That makes you a consumer. You need to be a well-educated and well-informed consumer. And the problem with the rankings is that if you get so blind to the rankings of what some reporter thinks, some list that some reporter came up with to try to generate clicks and controversy, realize that might not be guiding you in the best way for what you need in your career. So just be a well-informed consumer. And that's the end of my those are the end of my slides that I've got. So I think I can stop sharing now. Did I?
Yes, we're all good.
Okay, great. Cool.
Awesome. So thank you so much. I really like the real estate example because you didn't really bother to change the font colors. So I totally knew at least the school on the left was very crimson.
Yes, I made the little boxes too. I had them match the colors to try to give that the hint.
Awesome. So I had a few prepared questions for you because, well, one of the things that we are trying to do with this video is also get a few clicks. I sort of kept our title very controversial. But tell me something. Like we talked a lot about like different ranking methodologies and why you should not be using rankings as your go-to for school selection, right? Tell me a little bit more about when you should actually use rankings. When are they ever helpful?
I think the rankings are helpful at the beginning in terms of if you know nothing about business school, right, then I think it at least helps give you a starting point to assess what is the overall reputation of each of these programs.
Right.
And like I said before, it helps give you some information all in one place, like the average GMAT scores, or perhaps, the acceptance rates. It might be one sort of place where a lot of these statistics around a school are sort of compiled into one place. I'll give you an example. For example, like Yale Business School, again, great program. They have completely overhauled it and they are going up in the rankings accordingly and understandably and deservedly so. But for years, Yale was, when Yale started its business school, it was not even a business school. It was like a public policy management program. And so it really was not a full-on MBA in the way that we think of today. So for many years, I think, I didn't know this until I started researching business schools a zillion years ago. I would have thought that Yale is like, Yale Law School is the #1 law school in the world, or at least in the US for US law. And Yale overall is such a famous name that I would have thought that Yale Business School would have been like 3rd in the rankings. And at the time, especially when I was applying, it was like 17th or something. So I do think that helps you because so many business schools are affiliated with famous parent universities. It can sometimes be difficult to separate out there can be differences between the quality of the parent university versus the quality of the business school. So
you don't think I should go to John Hopkins?
That's a great example. Perfect example, right? Johns Hopkins, probably the world's best biology, medicine, medical school, or at least one of the best in the world. I don't know where their MBA program is in the rankings, probably not even in the top 20 or 30. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but that's a perfect example of a university that is, if you want to study like stem cell research or whatever, Hopkins is the mecca for you, but it's not going to be a great business school.
So I wanted to chat a little bit about that effect as well, and I think something like that happened to Michigan, which is the school I'm sort of done with right now, but just graduated. So when I joined Michigan back in 2018, Michigan did this jump in the U.S. News rankings where Ross was at like number 7, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I went to Michigan, like everybody kept talking about the fact that look at that, Ross is number 7. That is like holy shit, this is great. And I was like, look, I mean, I've seen this before, and in my opinion, and I'm pretty sure that I might be upsetting a few people at Michigan, but I think number 7 is the best we can do, right? Because one of the biggest deterrent at Michigan is that it's not in like a big city. So every other school in the top 8, top 9, they're all centered around big cities. So the best we can do is number 7. And sure enough, like the next year Michigan was number 10. This year Michigan's number 12. There's this weird thing that US News does. I think it's a cop-out where they tie a bunch of schools,
Yeah.
right? So Michigan now is tied with Duke and Tuck, which I think we are better than both of those, but I might be a little bit biased. So how do you decide when schools are too close to compare? One other example that comes to my mind was back in 2018, Stern took a nosedive in rankings because of like some weird audit issue or something like that. I think they forgot to pay them or something like that happened. And Stern was like number 16 or 17, and now it's back up, right? So then I know that in a post MBA and employment matters a lot, but for international students, we are all recruiting in the same employers. Like there is no specific thing. Like most international students come to a US business school to make a lot of money, get into consulting or tech. That's it. Those are the two things that exist. Sure, there might be some edge cases for people who would want to go to investment banking, but consulting and tech, that's pretty much it. So how do you make a decision between, for example, a Stern and a Duke if you want to get into consulting or tech, and they both recruit very similar? Do you look at rankings at all or not so much?
I don't think you look at rankings that much at all. If they're very similar in the rankings or even within, say, five places or 10, I mean, okay. Oh my gosh, there's so many things I could say. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about consulting in particular, right? Consulting, there's this idea that like, oh, if I go to Harvard, I'm automatically going to get a job at McKinsey, and if I go to Stern, I'm never getting a job at McKinsey. And that's not true at all, right? If you, as you said a second ago, the same recruiters are going to all of the different business schools, and they're looking for the top talent that's going to help their business crush their competition, right? So if that talent is associated with a lower school in the rankings, they're not going to care, right? If you go to Harvard or Stanford or Wharton and you show up to that McKinsey interview and they give you a case and you're like, I don't know what this is, like you're not getting the job, right? Like if you show up to like an investment banking or an asset management type of interview and they're like, okay, so which sector should I be investing in, and what's the name of a mid cap market company that we should like, and you're like, oh, I don't know, I mean, I go to Harvard but I don't actually know. No, you're gonna bomb, you're gonna crash and burn, right? So first of all, realize that for especially these large companies, they have a very defined recruitment process, and doing well in that you just need to get in front of that recruiter and do well in that process. Where you go to school, maybe some schools might have more spots available, but right. It's not like it's not, I think that it varies more depending upon how many people go to the school. Right. But somebody who just knocks it out of the park, who goes to a Ross or a Fuqua, like they're going to get that job. And someone who goes to Stanford who shows up in, sweatpants and sneakers and is like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know what numbers are. Like,
is that how you see everyone at Stanford?
Yes. No, they don't wear sneakers. They wear flip-flops. The weather's really nice.
By the way, a quick consulting thing, because I recruited consulting too. And when you actually, so your first round, you're interviewing with random people. Like, for example, at Ross, you could interview with someone who went to Ross. You could interview someone who went to Kellogg. However, when you go to final rounds, you will definitely interview with a person who did not go to your school. So when I interviewed in the Chicago offices, I only interviewed with people from Kellogg or Booth or some Sloan, but Ross was completely intentionally removed. So, like, just because you went to Wharton doesn't necessarily mean you're only going to be interviewed by people from Wharton. So that's also sort of removes some of that bias too.
That's a great insight, and I'm glad to hear that the schools do that. That's actually really. I'm sorry that the firms do that. That's really smart. And so to your previous comment around like, well, okay, let's say I want to go into consulting and I get into an NYU versus a Fuqua. I also think that for these big consulting jobs or other very popular jobs, a lot of it is also geography based, right? You recently mentioned, you just said Chicago office. If you go to Ross, chances are the Chicago office is going to be the one that recruits you, right, as is they're going to recruit Booth and Kellogg. Getting to the San Francisco office, if you really want to live in San Francisco, go to Haas. Right? Don't think about like, well, let's see, where is Haas on the, they're 7th, and some other school is 3rd, and there is so much to be said for the geographic proximity, not only in terms of recruiting, but in terms of developing your network and those valuable networking resources, even if you're not doing the traditional recruitment game. One story that I have is that when I was in business school, I used to work in the television industry prior to business school. I went to Harvard. And after business school, there was this job back, at a media company in LA that I was dying to get. And I was like the second, like they had narrowed it down to me and one other person. And then they were like, look, we're giving it to the other person, not because of anything against you, but because this other person goes to Anderson at UCLA, and she has been doing a project with us for the past 6 months. And so we opened up, when we went into this job process, we kind of knew we wanted to hire her, but we just opened it up and did the job, because we had to for HR purposes. But right, they were like, look, you're probably great, but we're going to go with the person we know. And of course, I don't blame them. There was no hard feeling. Like, I would do the same thing. Wouldn't any human being, when given the potential to hire a stranger versus someone that they've known and worked with for 6 months, they're going to go with the person they know. Why take a risk?
So you mean even though you went to HBS, you didn't automatically feel superior to everybody else who went to every other business school?
You know me better than that. I would never.
Yeah,
there are some douches. Like maybe we should come up with our own rankings, Souvik, and make it like the douche rankings. Like, obviously there are douches at HBS, but there are douches at every school too. Yeah, there are definitely people there who would be like, whatever, I went to Harvard and I'm amazing, but blah. There are a lot of people though who are really nice at every program. And no, I mean, not feel automatically.
That's totally true. And Howard has like 1,000 people, so you'll have all kinds of people. But I wasn't trying to get to people at HBS. I'm trying to sort of take a dig on the people who sort of blindly rely on rankings and sort of have this weird mentality that just because you're in HBS, that's it. The world stops there, and that's just so not true. In fact, we got a few comments at the beginning of the video, like, is how to get into Harvard Business School, which in my opinion is such a weird way to think about it, because you're sort of looking at business school as the end and not like as a place that gets you where you want to be. So yeah, no, that is pretty strange. So we are sort of getting to the end of the video today, but Maria, I know you run Applicant Lab. I know a lot of our people haven't seen Applicant Lab in action. Do you want to take a few moments and talk about what Applicant Lab does?
Sure. Okay. So in a nutshell, when you apply to business school, if you haven't already started looking into the process, it's actually a pretty complicated process, and it's a dangerous one. There are a lot of pitfalls pitfalls and traps. The schools will sometimes ask essay questions, for example, that you might look at it and think, oh, here's my opportunity to brag about myself, but the last thing you should do is brag. Anyway, MBA admissions, super nuanced, super complicated. And so there are people out there like me who are admissions consultants, and we specialize in helping you package your story and present it in the best way possible so that the admissions officers will look at your profile and say, wow, this is great. I want to talk to this person. Let's bring them in for an interview, et cetera, et cetera. Now, most admissions consultants, especially those of my caliber, charge about $350 an hour for their time. And so a one school package that is help with only one school's application, the price for other admissions consultants tends to be about $4,000 to $5,000 US. And then it just goes up from there for additional schools. What I have done with Applicant Lab is I have taken my over 15 years of admissions expertise, starting when I was a volunteer at the admissions office at Harvard Business School, and I have turned it into a series of online exercises that guides you through the exact same advice that I would give you if I were talking to you on the phone and charging you $350 an hour. But instead, since it's available online, the price point is dramatically lower. In fact, GMAT Club members, there's a 10% off GMAT Club coupon. So the price is actually $270, $269 technically. And for that, you get access to unlimited advice for unlimited schools. I've got all of the top programs in there. I dissect all of the essay questions. So what matters most to you and why? That's a huge trap of a question. The biggest trap in MBA admissions, speaking of Harvard, is Harvard Business School's essay question, which is, what else should we know about you? Very open-ended, and therefore they give you a lot of rope to hang yourself with. So if you watch my videos, I will teach you what those traps are, what those mistakes are, and conversely, what are the strongest things to focus on for all of the different schools. So it's available online whenever you want to. The other benefit, aside from cost, is that it's available 24/7. So with other admissions consultants, you would have to email them and set up a time to talk, and then it's back and forth, and how's Tuesday at 4? With Applicant Lab, you can work on it whenever you want at your own pace, which is why sometimes people, for example, if they only have a few weeks before a deadline, they sign up for Applicant Lab and they power through, and they're able to get through things a lot more quickly because they don't have to sit around and wait for someone to get back to them with availability. So please do check it out. I think it completely replaces the need for an admissions consultant, but even if you're working with another admissions consultant, it can help you save a ton of money and can help you augment advice you might be getting elsewhere. So please check out my product. If you like my advice here today, there's a lot more where that came from in the lab.
Awesome, Maria. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon again on the channel. And we have run short of time, so we couldn't really get to a bunch of questions. But I just want to take one quick question for you because I think this might help other people as well. So somebody says that if a school consistently is in the top 20, can it ever be worse than a school in top 50? And I think we get this a lot on the forums. We have a new forum for people who are sort of deciding among different schools. And we often get this a lot. I have an admit from a top 20 or top 15 school. Let's pick Ross, for example, right? But also, I have another admit from top 30 school, and I have significant amount of scholarship, right? So this comes up so many times. And I was in this dilemma because I had a few other admits as well. So do you have a general advice on what you should do, or is it too specific and too pointed?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the person and their situation. There are a couple of different thoughts on that. I think for people who, for example, are getting the MBA primarily for the education component of it. Let's say they work for a family business and they want to take over the family business later. And so they really are going to the MBA program primarily to get the education and the management toolkit. Then in that case, maybe taking a higher scholarship at a lower ranked school might be worth it, right? Because they're not going there to transform their lives. They're not going there to, try to multiply their salaries by 3, 4x or whatever. So in that case, I think it might make sense. But for other people, look, God willing, after you graduate from business school, you're going to have a career for 25, 30, 35 plus years of your life. And so I realize that the upfront cost of business school might look very daunting, right? I recently had another candidate who got a very, very high scholarship at another school and had gotten no scholarship at Harvard because Harvard does not do they don't do merit scholarships. They only do need-based scholarships. Right. And so they were trying to decide, like, well, I was in love with Harvard before this, but now I don't know what to do. And I'm like, look, I know that $200,000, I know how much money, because I had to take out that amount of debt too. I got no scholarship from Harvard either. So I know how scary that is. But at the same time, if you think about dividing out or sort of amortizing that huge cost, a business school term, over the course of the rest of your career, I really think that it becomes a lot more manageable when you think about it that way. So I do think it comes down to each person's appetite for risk and for how much transformation they want to get from the degree. I will say, by applying to a business school and having them accept you, you're basically saying to them, I want you to take a chance on me. Right. I promise that if you let me in, I have the leadership potential and the skills that I am worth a spot in your class. I'm good. I have that potential. So it's a little bit weird to me when people spend their entire application process proving to a school that I'm worthy, but then the school takes a chance on you, but then the student is not willing to take a chance on themselves. Right. When they say, well, I'm not going to take out any debt because I don't trust myself. Well, if you don't trust yourself to be successful enough in the future to pay back that loan, why should a school trust you? Like it's an uneven, calculation there. So, I think every person is different. I obviously chose the school that I thought was a better fit for me, even though they gave me $0.0 of help. And I'm glad I did it. But I also think that, some people, it depends what you're looking to get from the degree is what I would say. But if money is the only thing keeping you from going to a school that you're in love with, don't let that be the thing that impacts you.
I mean, I'm pretty happy I chose Michigan over some other options. And I do think that I sort of have the employer that I'm going to, the founder and CEO is very famous for building a no regret framework. So I think that's often helpful. All right, so I'm not going to digress so much. Sorry, Maria, you were saying.
I was just going to say, and I think for you, because I remember when you were trying to choose, because we were working together at that point, I think that Ross, this is something else that we didn't even get to touch upon in today's session, but this idea of culture and fit, and how happy are you going to be at the program? And this might sound like something trivial to someone who's early on in the process, but 2 years is a long time to spend. If there's a certain campus culture that just isn't the right fit for someone, that can be a miserable 2 years. I can think of a lot of top programs where I would have been desperately unhappy. Not because the people there are bad people, but just because the cultures at some of these different schools really does vary. And so I think that there's something to be said for choosing the school where you're going to be happiest, not only because I think mental health is important, but also because you're going to make those friendships and that network. Because at the end of the day, I trust you. Let's check in with me in a couple of years. Basically, nothing you learn in business school you're not going to be using it anymore. Right?
Wait, the value. My elementary economics classes are not going to be helpful.
Yeah, sorry, man. I don't know how to break it to you. But that network that you build and those friendships that you maintain over the years, that's what's really going to be valuable to you going forward. Because you don't need to know that economic framework, but as long as you have a classmate who does, you can call that person up and be like, hey, I need to know this framework. Tell me about it. And so that's why the network is such a valuable part of the experience. And you're not going to build a strong network at a place where you feel like a fish out of water. So I think you made a really strong choice.
Awesome. I mean, I think so too. I'll check in with you in 5 years and see what happens.
Hopefully we'll talk before then, but yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maria. This was great. I hope to see you soon. And thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe out there.